Welcome to the 51st episode of the Known Pleasures podcast. This is the podcast where we discuss the music of the post-punk and new wave movements of the late 70s and early 80s. In the episode description, you will find a link to our Facebook page, our Instagram page, our YouTube channel, and our Twitter handle. And now, I think it's my turn to introduce the subject of today's podcast. Okay, I'm going to attempt the introduction without making any tortured puns based on the band's song titles. Okay, here we go. In 1980, the Pretenders were everywhere, with the first number one single of the 80s, an album that was chock full of great songs, and an image that could not be ignored. In today's episode, we'll discuss the first three albums and follow Chrissy's journey from Akron, Ohio to the streets of London. Now, let us take you back to 1980, when the Pretenders were the talk of the town. Oh, damn. I almost made it. And scene.
I think it could be time for that cricket sound effect.
I think we might have to go back to before 1980 somehow.
We could do.
We will. The reason why I said 1980, because they were the talk of the town. And basically, in 1980, they were very much in the headlines, whereas before 1980, no one knew Chrissy Hynde from...
But Talk of the Town came out in 81, didn't it?
Yeah, but I wasn't talking about the song Talk of the Town. I'm talking
how
about
could you? Oh, right.
They were the actual
just
talk of the
nothing
town.
to do with the song title. I can't understand how that's possible with you. To not be talking about the Talk of the Town song.
Well, I think it's high time we went back to 1951.
51? Oh, that's way too far back.
Enough of this 1980 post-punk nonsense. Chrissy Hynde was born in Akron, Ohio in September 1951. And we've talked about Akron before, being the hometown of Devo.
And the rubber capital of the world.
Yes.
Probably.
And in fact...
As in rubber tyres, not condoms.
Yes, indeed.
Or maybe both.
Yeah. Well, my research was thorough, but not thorough enough. Chrissy said about Akron that it had a distinctive smell, that the pong was like you get patching out in a hot rod.
Patching out?
Which I think means burning rubber. I thought that was interesting to be like walking the streets of Akron with that.
With that acrid.
That
acrid Akron smell.
Yeah. She grew up in Akron and Cleveland. Her parents were Bud and Dolores.
Of course.
And
which was which?
How all-American is that? And Bud was a former Marine as well.
Yes.
Chrissy became a little bit of a hippie. Mm-hmm. This being the mid to late 60s when she was a teen. She wrote a love song to Paul McCartney when she was 13 on guitar. Mm. And Chrissy says, my mother, ever stylish and impeccable, was dismayed at having a hippie daughter. It bugged me at the time, as in parental disapproval, but had it not been for their total refusal to accept my need to rock, I might have stayed in Ohio and married a biker and be reaching under the sofa for my teeth now. So, hippiedom was where she was at. She
didn't she used to go and see a lot of bands, sneak out to see bands when she was very young, and so she was into that scene at a very young age.
Yeah, she said she was not the model teenage girl that any parents would have wanted. And she said, I didn't date boys, I was a lousy student, and all I wanted to do was go and see bands, which is the same with me. I didn't date boys.
They came later.
I was a lousy student, and yeah, as you know, I saw millions of bands.
There ends the parallel.
I was hoping that was going to have legs further than it did, Greg.
Yes, it kind of petered out there.
It was shaping up quite promisingly.
Now, you mentioned, Patrick, that she was, but did you mention she went to Kent State?
She did, yes, that's right.
What happened there?
And not a lot, but there was
an incident.
A terrible, terrible incident. The infamous demonstration where four students, I think it was, were killed by the National Guard. And a friend of hers was killed. I think it was a defining moment for her, as it was for members of Devo, I think.
The end of hippiedom. She was in a band with Mark Mothersbaugh of Devo.
She was.
And what was that band called?
The band was mysteriously known as Sat Sun Mat.
Yes.
Which stood for?
Well, it only occurred to me during this week what I think it stood for.
I reckon I know what you're going to say.
Okay, you go.
It's a cinema reference. Saturday, Sunday and matinee.
Did you think that when we were talking about Devo back then?
No, I didn't know it back then.
Yeah.
I thought as soon as I saw it.
On the marquee.
And they asked her to sing with them In her memoir, Reckless, she describes Mark Mothersbaugh as a bespectacled oddball, which is probably about right. She said she couldn't face rehearsing in the same room as the band. She shut herself in the laundry room. And they played songs like 40,000 Headmen by Traffic.
40,000 headmen couldn't make me change my...
And if you've heard 40,000 Headmen by Traffic with its flute and bluesy vocals, it's hard to imagine either Devo or Pretenders playing a song like this. But they played one gig in a church hall and she hated the whole thing. So she had a kind of a love-hate relationship, I think, with being a singer and being a star, but she totally wanted to rock, that's for sure.
And when did she get out of there? Because that's something you could see was going to happen, right?
Yeah, well, she was a massive Anglophile. She loved the English accent and she felt that England was where the best bands came from, the Stones, the Beatles, the Kinks, etc. And she didn't take American rock very seriously.
Apart from Iggy Pop.
Including bands like the Stooges. Early on she thought they were kind of like fractionally inferior. In 1973, she came to England, and not long after arriving in England, she met another emaciated oddball in the form of the NME journalist Nick Kent. And she was on the fast track, or indeed the very, very slow track, to forming her own band. But it was extraordinary that she just ran into him pretty early on. Then she very gradually became someone who, even if she'd never played in the Pretenders, she'd be, I think, famous on a kind of a cult level for her connection with what happened over the next 3 or 4 years.
This was still 73, so it was way before punk.
Yeah, that's right.
That she was writing for New Musical Express.
Yeah, and she was invited to write for NME. She said that my only qualification for writing for NME was that I was as frustrated as the rest of them. A frustrated musician, opinionated, hungover, illegal in the workplace, devoid of ambition, and if I couldn't find a word in my dumb guy vocabulary, I would make one up. Yeah, she did say that the more dismissive and poorly written her reviews, the more the NME applauded her. And she said that there was absolutely no good music around at the time, which I suppose was like 73, 74-ish.
So she wasn't a fan of Slade then?
No, or Neil Diamond for that matter.
Okay.
Even Gary Glitter.
ABBA?
Yeah, ABBA 74.
Yeah, well, there you go.
So we've got her hanging out in London for a couple of years.
Well, can I just say that what amazed me about this is that the story I originally heard when I was younger was that she was from America, she went to the UK, got into the punk scene, started a band. But in researching this, I realized that she was all over the place. She went back to America at some point. She was in Europe, and as you said, in France there for a while.
Yeah.
So the actual story takes a while to evolve because it sounds like she's trying to find herself, I guess.
Yeah, and she was taking a lot of drugs and drinking a lot and just experimenting in general and being almost sort of willfully aimless.
Well, she was in her early 20s, so I suppose, and maybe she was indulged by her parents to a degree as well.
And she was no kind of intellectual. She wasn't academic. She had no interest in that side of things. And, genuinely the only thing she wanted to do was to play rock and roll. And opportunities hadn't quite presented themselves for her. So, she was doing that wandering around thing. And then she got to know Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, started working in their shop.
Well, the shop was Let It Rock at that point. That's another thing, is that according to the documentary, the Pistol documentary, it suggested that she was in the shop when it was called Sex and when the Sex Pistols were getting together. But she was actually working there long before that.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
I guess it made a better story if they said she was there.
Yeah. and certainly a simpler story.
Yeah.
So she went back to the States, played in a covers band or two there, came back to England and, as you say, France, and so on. Eventually, well, I don't know whether you can say eventually, but in about 1976, I think, 75, 76-ish, she started writing songs with Mick Jones, future Clash mainstay. And she said she started writing songs with Mick while his gran made them beans on toast. And she said it became a regular thing and I really looked forward to it, especially the beans on toast.
Is that why they called her Chrissy Hines?
Ah, very good.
Come on.
Very good.
I'm going to put a big round of applause in after that.
Yeah. You might want to redo the intro now. Hang on, I've got one. But around about that time, Mick, I think, started playing music with Paul Simonon and with Joe Strummer, and he gravitated towards them. And as Chrissy said, Strummer put the aggression in and the songs were better with me out. Good call, Mick. So, she was quite magnanimous about that.
It's fair to say that punk was fermenting at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And
if not fully blown, probably late 75, early 76, something in that.
And she was right in the middle of it. Name someone who was significant in the punk scene. And I mean, the anecdotes as well as I do in terms of her association with John Lydon and Sid Vicious and so on.
She was almost married to them, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was nearly Mrs. Vicious or Mrs. Rotten. And her green card, well, the equivalent of her green card, the UK equivalent. Yeah. Yeah, she was desperate to stay in the country. And I don't know how she managed to retain her residency when I don't think she did get married, did she?
I think it was just easier to disappear in those days. A little bit, working for cash and all that sort of stuff.
All roads led to Hereford.
That's right.
Well, eventually.
Well, she also dated Steve Jones, which was something that from the Sex Pistols, which I didn't know at the time. But she was there. She was there or thereabouts.
She actually played with a band. Did you mention the Masters of the Backside band? There was a band called Masters of the Backside, which is a great name. After she left, they became the Damned.
Yeah. They should have kept that first name. I mean, they would have gone a long way with that one.
Yeah, that's right.
It just seemed like she was desperately wanted a band, and she kind of associated herself with all these different people, and as soon as she left, they went on to something bigger.
She was friends with Viv Albertine.
Oh, Viv, yes.
Who formed the Slits. She was friends with Lemmy from Motorhead and Steve Strange.
Yes.
In the band Moore's Murderers, which is a remarkably tasteless name for a band even by punk standards, relating to the murder of children in the Yorkshire moors.
In the moors.
I'm confused about how the band, are we moving on to that?
Yeah.
In March 78.
The foundation point, I think, there were even more false starts along the way, but Lemmy had said, you've got to meet this mate of mine from Hereford, whose name is Gas Wild, possibly not his real name. And Gas said that he knew a bass player in Hereford called Pete Farndon, and that was the starting point for the band. And Chrissy, the only thing she knew about Pete Farndon was that he'd just been playing in a band in Australia called the Bushwhackers.
I remember the Bushwhackers.
And the Bushwhackers hold a very particular place, I think, in Australian music consciousness, because everyone knows of the Bushwhackers. They played 1 million gigs. They were really popular. They had hit albums, and they were kind of like a pop folky sort of country kind of band. They might even still be around.
But were they similar to the Pogues, or am I wrong in that?
Yeah, maybe less edgy, maybe.
Yeah.
I love the fact that Pete would have been touring Australia playing songs like Ned Kelly was born in a ramshackle hut.
Ned Kelly was born in a ramshackle hut.
Red Hot Wood Stove and Murrumbidgee River. And then joining the Pretenders. And in fact, Pete stayed friends with the band, and when Pretenders toured Australia in 1982, he went to see them at the Manly Vale Hotel.
There's a wonderful, this is moving ahead a bit, but there's a wonderful thing on YouTube where Donny Sutherland, I think, was interviewing them. And
on the Australian Saturday morning show Sounds.
On Sounds, yes. And as soon as Donny Sutherland started addressing Pete about the Bushwhackers, the other three members got up and walked away.
When you left the Bushwhackers, was there any ill feeling there between you and the guys, or it was just the fact you wanted to go back and join a group in England?
I think they wished me every success. Now they hate my guts.
No,
But,
you went and saw them the other night.
Yeah, why would anyone hate you?
Because, she says that to all the bass players.
Which was a wonderful moment. They were actually quite affable, nice people when interviewed.
That's a great clip, which becomes particularly poignant later in the story.
Yeah.
So they had the two of them now. All they needed was a tape machine called Winston.
Called Winston, yeah.
No, sorry, that's another band story. Pete knew a guitarist who was a younger brother of a girl he'd gone out with for a while, a fellow called James Honeyman Scott. And James didn't like punk at all.
No.
And Chrissy was slightly offended by that. The three of them, I think, played together, did a demo together in London, including Stop Your Sobbing. That was one of the songs, and The Wait. Later on, she said, I casually waved goodbye as Jimmy got on the train back to Hereford without thinking about when or even whether we'd meet up again. Then I sat down to listen to the demos. I was stunned. These weren't my songs anymore, they were ours. James Honeyman Scott was the one I'd been searching for. it was him, which I think is a really beautiful quote.
He became subsequently a real hero to people like Johnny Marr. And everyone, a lot of people referenced his guitar playing style.
Chrissy had been coming at music from a really kind of punk standpoint, but as she said, he just brought melody, and you hear the Pretenders' music, and it's an extraordinary synthesis of elements, and one of the main ones, maybe even the main one, apart from Chrissy's vocals, is that guitar sound and the.
So, is this the three musicians now?
Yes, well,
Martin Chambers isn't called Martin Chambers.
They did have a drummer, a fellow called Jerry McElduff.
Mm-hmm.
So hang on, the first drummer you said was completely different.
Yes, sorry, they ditched gas.
They ran out of gas.
Who needs gas?
and they went with Jerry McElduff, and then they went from Jerry McElduff to Martin Chambers.
But they were friends with Nick Lowe, or should I say Chrissy was friends with Nick Lowe because Chrissy was friends with everyone.
With everyone, yeah.
She sent Nick the demo, and Nick really liked Stop Your Sobbing and said, yeah, let's record that. So they recorded that with Jerry.
Which was a cover, we should say.
On drums,
too.
yeah.
Strangely, it was a Ray Davies song.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was a big fan of the day.
Yeah.
Kinks.
A Kinks song, and they may or may not feature later on in the story. Who knows?
May not, yeah.
They recorded it, but they weren't entirely happy with the drummer, and they knew Pete and James knew a drummer/driving instructor in Hereford. And they thought, you know what, we could do with some driving lessons. No, they thought, let's get this guy in. And as Chrissy said, when Martin Chambers came along to the rehearsal studio, we plugged in and started playing Precious, as in the song Precious. And I remember clearly I had to turn around and face the wall. I was laughing so hard because as soon as Martin started playing with us, I knew this was it. We had the band.
Oh, nice. Although, why was she laughing? Surely just a smile would have been
sufficed. I suppose, yeah, a smile would have sufficed. So Stop Your Sobbing came out as a single in January 79.
There's one thing you gotta do to make me still want you. Gotta stop sobbing, I will. Gotta stop sobbing, I will. Stop.
And the subsequent single was Kid in June, and which reached roughly the same spot in the charts, number 33. Then what happened?
Then everything exploded.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting, those two singles, because they're very pleasant. They're very pleasant songs. And then Kid, by the way, is apparently about a prostitute whose son finds out what she does for a living. And then Chrissy added, possibly unnecessarily, not all songs are autobiographical.
I've heard that song many times over the years. I didn't realise that's what the song was about.
Yeah.
And I love the first line, Kid, what changed your mood?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe my mum telling me she's a hooker, maybe that changed. You want to give me some time to deal with this?
Process.
I can process this. Yeah.
What did happen next?
Well, actually, before we go on to the big hit single, can I just say that the name Pretenders was inspired by the Sam Cooke version of the Platters hit, The Great Pretender.
Oh, yes, I'm the great pretender.
Chrissy said it fit in nicely with the band's down-to-earth style, totally unpretentious. Patrick, you're a wordsmith. Aren't pretenders pretentious by definition? Am I wrong there?
Sometimes they're just aspiring. You can just be aspiring to something if you're a pretender.
Okay.
I think pretender has a few different meanings. The one you're describing is definitely the most commonly used one.
It made me laugh when I read that, but I thought I may be wrong about that, but I'll let Patrick confirm that.
And what happened next was going to change things forever.
The world.
And the song was Brass in Pocket.
We got brass in pocket. Gunpowder. I'm gonna.
When did you first hear Brass in Pocket, mate?
I really don't know. I just remember that I noticed it straight away. It was a completely different song than, I've said this before, than anything else I'd ever heard. I don't really know how to describe it now. I've watched a few videos deconstructing it. But yeah, it's such a strange song. I don't know. It's fantastic, but it's not anything that I can actually, if I was trying to tell somebody what it sounded like, I don't think I could.
Well, I don't think it was that unusual. If you listen to the song's demo, which is also on YouTube, it was a bit slower and almost a little reggae-ish.
got brass in pocket.
When Chris Thomas heard it, he really liked the song, but he was like, he said it needed more bounce. So he when they did it, they picked up the tempo of it a bit. I mean, it's great. It's hooky. It's full of colloquial terms that I haven't understood for years until just recently looking them up. Brass in pocket
Got brass in pocket.
means having money, or it's in some areas of the internet, it means being cocky or sure of yourself. When you have bottle or got bottle,
Got bottle.
it means courage or confidence. Detroit leaning
Detroit leaning.
is apparently having one hand on the wheel when your body is leaning way back in the seat whilst driving. Doesn't sound very safe. Skank
I got a new skank.
is a North American term for to swindle or to deceive, but it's also a Jamaican dance. And reet
Sorry.
means righteous. So it's only taken me 40-odd years to work out what that song was about.
Yeah.
But yeah, it did really well. Number 1 in the UK, number 2 in Australia, and 14 in the US. So they pretty much arrived.
Yeah. Well, she had worked as a waitress in Akron, saying things like, apparently, would you like sour cream or butter on your baked potato, sir? Which is, in fact, paraphrasing a lyric from a future song. But yeah, so she was nothing if not polite. So you can see why she would have been relatively successful and could have made a solid career had she chosen to do so.
As a waitress serving beans, perhaps. Beans on toast.
Her favourite. She didn't need 57 varieties either.
No, that's right.
One was plenty.
Yeah, so that video was the first time I actually laid eyes on them. I saw the video on all the music shows, one particular one, Countdown. The host, Ian Meldrum, just raved about the album, and he was a huge supporter of the Pretenders.
Another album that's out now. You haven't seen or heard much about them except for what I've been telling you. Brass in Pocket is the single by the Pretenders. This is a great album. Chrissy Hine, the lead singer here, is an amazing lead singer.
Are we on to the album now?
Yeah, let's go on to the album. Why not?
Self-titled debut album came out in January 1980. It's really different to... The singles don't really set up the attitude that kind of permeates this album. It is one... She was one tough... Like, her persona was extremely kind of hard-edged.
I mean, the fact that she said fuck off in that first song.
But not me, baby. I'm too precious. Fuck off.
Anyone who wasn't into punk or whatever and bought that album on the strength of Brass in Pocket because it was a hit, I think they would have been a little bit taken aback by that first song.
Or Stop Your Sobbing.
Yes.
Oh, I like Stop Your Sobbing. Let's buy this.
Yeah, you'll love this.
You bought the album?
I bought the album on the strength, I think, of Kid and Brass in Pocket, but I was surprised as to how full-on side 1 is and how commercial and easy listening side 2 is.
Well, side 2 has all the singles pretty much.
Yeah. But it also, the reggae is quite, not poppy, but it's quite accessible. Whereas there are songs on side 1 which are not accessible at all.
Private Life, I think, is an amazing song. It's so inventive, it's so clever, it's so funny, it's so dark.
And weirdly, it sounds like it was written for Grace Jones, those lyrics and everything. And the fact that she went on to perform it, I thought
To record it,
It was the same year.
perfect. Was it the same year, was it?
Yeah.
With the B-side of She's Lost Control to the Joy Division.
Wow.
That's I feel pity when you lie. That's just the way she delivers those lines.
I don't know what she ever saw in this guy. I mean, does he sound like a catch to you? He's indecisive, he's insecure, he's a little bit weepy, he's a tad over theatrical, and he suffers from sexual complications.
Yeah.
The line that I found kind of most interesting in a way, because Chrissy is so brilliantly direct. She's a real wordsmith in her own way. Her lyrics are great, I think. There is a line in it which is J'ai les glandes with your theatrics.
J'ai les glandes with your theatrics. Your acting's a drag.
And so J'ai les glandes is French for I've had a gutful, basically. So I have the glands, as in my bile is rising, kind of thing.
Oh, right.
When Grace Jones recorded it, she changed the lyric. She changed it to J'en ai marre with your theatrics.
J'en ai marre with your theatrics. Your acting's a drag.
That's not Gerard Depardieu telling you his favourite member of the Smiths. In fact, J'en ai marre is I've had enough
Oh, okay.
in French. But I did wonder whether, in fact, this guy was so theatrical that he did literally say, "Oh, je l'ai blonde," and she was mimicking him using that actual term, because it's such a weird term to use when it's not an obtuse lyric. No. Otherwise, she's not beating around the bush. So, yeah, that's probably my favourite song on the album, and maybe my favourite Pretender song of all.
Mark, what did you think of the first album?
Yeah, pretty much what you've said. The singles are all on the second side. I liked the song Space Invaders. It had a bit of synth on it. Well, the only synth on any of their albums.
Yeah, they weren't a synth band.
No, Mystery Achievement is great. Precious is great. I said earlier that I thought it sounded to me like the Police and Elvis Costello in that they sounded like they were set up to be successful in America. This was the kind of music that people didn't like New Wave would like. And so I could see that it was kind of muscular. Reminded me a bit of things that Patti Smith and maybe Debbie Harry and Joan Jett had already sort of tried to do. But it's a pretty comprehensive first album. I mean, Brass and Pocket's obviously the standout track. I still think it's such a weird, the guitar is so ingenious on that, and everything about it's brilliant. So it's impossible to overstate now how important that song was, I think. It was everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it was huge.
The diversity of the album, I think, is really quite something. So you've got a rhythm section that is extremely versatile. They can really rock, but they can also give things a lot of space, slow things down, some weird time signatures there. Apparently, Martin Chambers said that Pete and I did a fair amount of work on our own in terms of the rhythm section, being able to play Chrissy's odd timing things. We'd come in a couple of hours ahead of the others and baby talk our way through the songs, da-da-da, boom, boom. And, she didn't count in the traditional way, so we had to interpret the counts. Once we made the adjustment and learned to go with her flow, it became second nature. It's the bedrock of Pretender's music. I don't always know who's playing what guitar line, but between Chrissy and James, they just fantastic kind of dual guitar attack. And I did wonder what the two of you as guitarists, think of the guitar work on this album and maybe the first two albums.
Well, Private Life is a great example of what they're both doing that kind of complement each other. Chrissy is locking down the chords on the 2 and the 4 in that reggae style. Hang on, let me get my guitar. She's doing this. And James is playing a sort of a counterpoint melody doing this. And on a song like Tattooed Love Boys, it's pretty much the same thing. Chrissy is playing along with the bass and drums, and James is playing another kind of 3-note riff. So Chrissy is playing what you'd expect a songwriter to play, the chords that are the foundation of the song. If you took away the other 3 musicians and Chrissy was just there with her guitar playing the song for you, it would be exactly the same as what she plays with the band. But what James is doing is adding colour and shapes and basically dressing up the song.
And lots of different types of guitar sounds as well.
Yeah.
So some proper kind of heavy rock, punky type stuff, some sort of classic post-punk sort of choppy type things, some beautiful, really beautiful chiming guitars. That's what struck me listening to this album, which I knew the singles and, a couple of the album tracks, Private Life and so on. But, yeah, I didn't really know the album, and I was really struck by just how broad the kind of guitar playing.
I wanted to ask you both, do you think this album qualifies them as somebody that we should be talking about coming out in January 1980?
I think so. I think...
and why?
There was still an element of punk in some of the songs. And you got to remember that as commercial as Brass and Pocket and Couple and Kid were, you got to remember that there were people like Blondie who were all of a sudden doing stuff that was a bit more melodic, a bit poppier. And the fact that they went down that road, I don't think that disqualifies them at all from being a post-punk band. I would argue that what they did later on, they certainly moved a long way away. But then again, so did So did a lot of bands.
Yeah. No, that's right.
But I think I think this is definitely, it has the hard edge, it has the attitude, it has Chrissy's lyrics, which were not standard top 40 style lyrics. Yeah, I think it definitely qualifies.
Yeah, there are definitely a few songs that don't qualify, and they tended to be the singles.
Yeah.
So the really kind of harder edge songs, I don't know that any of those songs were released as singles.
Precious was a single. That's pretty full on.
Which is amazing when you think about it, because there's nothing really catchy about it. I love the song, but there's nothing really that you say was.
But for the most part, they certainly put their most commercial foot forward, which I think is why perhaps some people who wouldn't think of them as being a post-punk band and maybe think of them as a more mainstream rock band might think along those lines, which I think is a legitimate point of view. To somewhat counter that, someone who loved the Pretenders was Bon Scott, singer of AC/DC.
Really?
So a friend of Bon Scott's says that Mick and I would go down and hang a bit with Bon, and he would play records like The Pretenders. Mick and I would look at each other and go, The Pretenders? Bon really liked The Pretenders.
Oh, that's the seal of approval right there.
Yeah, that's the rock and roll seal of approval anyway.
Absolutely.
And I don't know whether that just meant the singles, because Bon died
I was going to say,
about a month after the first album was released. It did go to show the breadth of fanship that they had.
Before we leave the first album, I'd like to talk about Tattooed Love Boys. You were talking before about unusual time signatures.
Yeah.
There is a breakdown in that, which for the life of me I can't count in. The song is about 120 beats per minute. So I put a click behind this to highlight how there's absolutely no logical way of counting this in. You see, so already they're out of time. I have no idea how they count it in.
7, 8 times, something like that.
Yeah, I've read online that it's 7/16 time, and this is where I get confused about this. But I count 7 beats to the first bar and 8 beats to the second bar like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
You are that.
Weirdly, they brought out a new single only a few months afterward.
Yeah, about, 2 months later.
Yeah, March 1980.
Yeah.
And this, I wanted to mention Talk of the Town, because it's my favourite Pretender song, by far.
Oh.
Single or otherwise. I don't know whether I can explain why, but I think the first time I heard it, I just thought, this is a great single. It's going to be huge. And it actually wasn't in Australia. It died. I think it was a hit in the UK. For some reason, people didn't like it. And I went around trying to get it, and I wound up buying, I think I showed you guys, I bought a promotional album that wasn't for sale. It had that stamped on it. I don't know how I bought it if it wasn't for sale. Yeah, I'm just amazed it wasn't a bigger hit, because on this album it had some live tracks on it, and then just selected songs from B-sides and whatever. But it had Talk of the Town on it. I'm really glad I purchased it, because I think it might be worth some money now. Interestingly, the band, the band Garbage with Shirley Manson, they recorded a song called Special, and at the end of the song she sings You're the Talk of the Town. And she wound up asking Chrissy Hine for permission to sing this. Now, you can't copyright a phrase like that, can you? I mean, Brenda Lee had a song called It's the Talk of the Town from 1962.
Yeah.
She didn't ask Brenda Lee to for permission. But it's an unusual thing for her to ask for. I love the song. My favourite lyric is, it's not my place to know what you feel. I'd like to know, but why should I? Who are you then? Who are you now? A common labourer by night, by day highbrow. Really great lyric. I've come to appreciate her lyric writing more and more over the last couple of months that I've been, reacquainting myself with the Pretenders. A wonderful song. Did you guys like it? Oh, hang on.
It's a hard act to follow, Graham.
I'll dial back my enthusiasm a bit.
No,
I thought it was okay. What do you guys think?
It kind of felt a little bit of a place filler. I quite liked it, but I didn't love it. And for me, it was one of those Pretenders songs that made me think, are they really post-punk?
You're probably right. Maybe that's why I like
You
it.
thought that at the time or now?
I thought that at the time. I mean, I don't know if it was even a conscious thought, but it was just, I quite liked the Pretenders, but, I'm not that
It
sold.
was no Private Life.
I'm not that sold on them. And I think I probably only heard Private Life 2 or 3 years after.
Okay, did you like it, Mark?
Yeah, I don't remember an EP coming out. I just remember all the singles that came out when the album came out about 18 months after the first album. Message of Love and all that stuff. I don't remember the EP.
There was an extended play which got to number 27 in the US, which...
Oh, wow.
They thought it was an album, but it was 5 songs.
Yeah,
I'm going to call that an EP. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's an
That's
EP.
an EP.
Yeah, yeah. Talk of the Town, Message of Love, which we'll get to. That was on it as well. So, yeah.
Message of Love fared better in Australia, and I do remember seeing that video quite a lot. It went to
absolutely.
15.
Yeah, so that was February 81, so that was
81.
11 months after.
Yeah, so after all that initial success, I imagine they would have been touring a lot during the rest of 1980.
For me, Message of Love is an absolute corker of a song.
Oh, okay.
They say, well, they used to say in Australia in the 1960s.
And we still say it at Known Pleasures now.
Yeah, I think Message of Love is a great single and extremely optimistic sentiment, almost sort of naive in its simplicity. I think it's a really beautiful lyric, and especially from someone like Chrissy, who does have that kind of cynicism in her kind of armoury. Rhythmically, again, it's just got a great groove, and it shows how versatile they were to have consecutive singles of Talk of the Town and Message of Love as well.
Interesting thing about Message of Love is that it came together in the studio as opposed to Chrissy writing it and the band kind of interpreting it later.
Okay.
And if you listen to it, it sounds like a jam.
Yeah.
Martin is playing the beat and the bass and guitars are repeating that B flat to A flat part. And it sounds like a song that wasn't fully formed when they went into the studio. It sounds like a jam. It's good.
Yeah,
I do really like it. A corker.
It is a corker. That's what Nick Kent wrote.
That's right, yes.
in his review. He said it was a dead set corker.
5 stars. Corker.
Another corker from Chrissy.
Did I tell you I used to know this girl?
That's right. She called me an emaciated oddball from memory.
August 81, The Pretenders 2, can I just say I wasn't a fan of this.
You were not?
I was not a fan of this. There's a couple of songs that I appreciate more now.
Did you buy this album as well?
I bought this on the strength of the last couple of singles.
Of the EP?
But just didn't think it was as good as anywhere near as good as the first one. I thought that The Adulteress and Pack It Up were like standard rock fare. Could have been any pub rock band around could have done that. Waste Not, Want Not is a great little reggae song.
Yep.
Day After Day, I like that song now. It didn't really jump out at me at the time, but I quite like that.
Way up in the sky, over the city, over Tokyo.
Jealous Dogs sounds like they just came up with the music and then Chrissy just threw some lyrics over the top of it. So
You don't like Jealous Dogs?
no, it just seemed like there wasn't much craft put in that as a song. It was just like musicians are playing away and then all of a sudden she sings a line and it just seems to keep on going. And I wasn't a fan, but I bought it and it did well. 7 in the UK, 18 in Australia and 10 in America.
And Chris Thomas again?
Chris Thomas again.
I think it did get reviews, certainly some reviews, which were along the lines of what you're describing as being a little bit of a pallid follow-up. Did you hear the album at the time, Mark?
I don't think I did. No. I've got written here that it sounds like a consolidation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I really like I Go to Sleep, which is a Ray Davies song.
Yep.
I think that's a beautiful version.
I go to sleep, sleep, and imagine that you're there with me. I go to
I was going to say about I Go to Sleep because it was
It was November 81.
Yeah, it was released subsequent to the album.
Yeah.
Yeah, a song by Ray Davies, but I don't think it was ever recorded by the Kinks.
Oh, really?
Cher.
I go to sleep, sleep, and imagine that you're there with me.
And Peggy Lee.
I go to sleep, sleep, and imagine that they're there with me.
Recorded non-charting versions of it in 1965. And the song is just kind of a non-song, in terms of the Ray Davies.
I just assumed that they did it.
Yeah, I don't think so.
I heard at the time that it was a Kinks song, and I said, oh. In New York, Hind finally met Ray Davies after the release of I Go to Sleep. So she got to meet her hero and wound up taking it a step further and having a child with him. I mean, how often does that happen?
Yeah. I was aware of the fact that the second album was considered to be, not as good as the first. And I hadn't really heard, again, I'd heard the singles and a couple of album tracks or whatever. But to me, it sounds really similar. And I would have said consolidation as well. So it's interesting that you had such a negative reaction. And I think it was probably because you were hoping for something as out of the box, as unusual and fresh as that first album. Whereas I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting it to sound like the Pretenders. And both albums do sound like the Pretenders to me.
I loved Pretenders 1 and I was hoping for Pretenders 2. But unfortunately, I got Pretenders 2. So I held the first album in such high esteem that I was just disappointed by the second album. But, and maybe it was one of those things, how sometimes bands release an album and then they go out and tour and they don't seem to have much time to stop and write. And then they release a second album of sort of hastily slapped together songs. That's kind of how I felt about it. But as I said, listening to it now, I appreciate and actually like a few more songs that I didn't at the time.
One of the things from the point of view of someone listening to the album closely for the first time years and years later is that the singles that were in some instances 18 months old by now, which are on the second album, you wouldn't be giving the band any credit for them, in terms of the second album effort. And your Message of Love is on the second album as well. And that's already two spots that you're going to go, well, it's a bit boring, because I already know those songs.
Yeah.
And so, I can see why it might have felt a bit lacking in freshness. But I do really like The Adulteress, Bad Boys, Talk of the Town is a lovely song.
It's a corker, I think.
Pack It Up, I think, is really funny. You guys are the pits of the world. Your insipid record collection, which is one of the great insults. Your insipid record collection.
If you want to upset someone, go straight for the record collection.
And ironically, or coincidentally, the guys in the band were friends of John McEnroe. And John McEnroe is famous for the phrase, you guys are the pits of the world.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay.
In terms of umpires. Tennis umpires. So anyway, that was the link there. And I love the chiming guitars on English Roses. Yeah, I do really like both of those albums. And it's interesting that you had such an aversion to it. And then we made it to March 1982 and their Australian tour and their appearance on the TV show Sounds. The quite brief clip on YouTube where they're being interviewed on a Saturday morning. So, you would expect them not to be in the... There are lots of clips of this show Sounds on YouTube where the interviewees are struggling to stay awake or, they look terribly hungover and whatever, but the Pretenders look like they're having a great time together. Yeah. They're mucking around together. They're sort of almost like a comedy ensemble, the way they're kind of interacting. And you think, those guys, they really like each other.
Yeah. Well, you got that feeling because I always think that Chrissy Hind is a prickly character. You don't want to get that on the wrong side of that sort of thing. But on that interview, they were...
She's a pussycat.
Yes. She was fantastic.
And they seemed to be getting along like a house on fire, but behind the scenes, it was absolutely falling apart.
Did you go and see them, Graham?
I went and saw them on the 20th of March at Brisbane's Festival Hall.
In 1982?
In 82. And they were great. But I just want to tell you my meeting one of the Pretenders stories, and this is the lamest meeting of a celebrity you will ever hear. Now, Mark, you've met Sting and Terry Hall and people like that, Patrick. You've met various football players. Basically, my friend and I, after the concert, we went to the Park Royal Hotel in Brisbane, which is where they were staying. And we walked down there and we just kind of hung around reception and we saw there was a room where they were in. And at one point, Martin Chambers walked out and he walked straight towards me. And I looked at him and I said, how you going? And he smiled and said, I'm going to bed. And that was it. That was my meeting of... So
he thought you said, where are you going?
Yeah, well, someone told me that the Brits don't say, how are you going? Or it's not something that you would say they would say. So, yeah, maybe he thought I was... So why did this stranger walk up and say, where are you going? But anyway, you can tick off, met one of the pretenders.
Yeah, that's right.
The drummer.
Yeah, the drummer. Yeah, the drummer.
The least one that you want to meet. In any
I actually really like Martin. I thought he was another one like the drummer of Blondie, a real visual, enthusiastic drummer.
Really good drummer.
But one thing I was going to say about the show is that at some point, Chrissy Hynde seemed to be angry at something with people in the audience. So she kept doing this. People who
Which
are
is what, Graham? Because
people who are listening.
What's that you just did?
For the people who are watching, I'm
that. Oh, I thought you meant that, not that.
Moving my right arm
like you're swishing
away
a fly.
from me in
like
a swishing motion.
Yes.
In a scornful swishing motion.
What they said, moving my hand away from my body.
It probably would have been better with the mystery if he just said doing this.
I thought the air from my hand going past the microphone would have worked. But yeah, she was pointing at people and doing that. And I have, to this day, I don't know what was upsetting her so much, but there was something going on. And I noticed that once again on YouTube, about a year before, they played Rock Palast. You know Rock Palast? It's a German music show where they film you. And in that, Chrissy Hynde went up to the mic at one point.
This is kind of obvious that I don't want you taking my pictures, so you can please fuck off with your cameras, all right?
Got really angry at them, so she can get...
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wouldn't like playing these days then, would she?
No, definitely she would hate it. Yeah. But the thing is, this show is being filmed. I don't know whether you guys know this, but when you film someone, it's like taking a lot of pictures one after the other.
Very quickly.
Very quickly.
It's like quick photos.
That's right. So she was upset at the audience. She would have been furious, the guy filming them.
Chrissy says about that tour of Australia, Japan, Thailand as well, maybe. The vibe was bad. She said the gigs were good, but the vibe was bad, that Pete's junkie persona had taken over and was inhabiting him, and that he was treating people really badly. He punched a janitor after, or maybe before, one of the Australian gigs, and James...
Do you know why?
Because he told him he couldn't smoke.
I thought he hadn't done the bathroom properly, something like that, which is fair enough.
I'm not sure. So James had enough, basically.
It was 3 months after I saw them that Pete Farndon was fired from the group.
Yep.
So those two albums are the only actual original lineup, the first and second album?
Yeah, just the two albums. Right. I'm glad I got to see them anyway. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So, Pete was kicked out, I think maybe on the 14th of June that year. Or
14th of June, yep.
Or thereabouts.
In 82?
In 82.
And then tragedy struck and James died of heart failure caused by cocaine intolerance.
2 days later.
2 days later.
And then there were two.
And just a terrible, terrible tragedy. They kept going, and 5 weeks after James's death, they were in the studio recording Back on the Chain Gang.
With two original members.
And Chrissy was 3 months pregnant by now, I think. And they had played the song quite a lot with James, and they'd thought it would make a pretty good single. It's a very kind of light-hearted lyric, given the kind of tragic circumstances, and apparently it was a bit of a tribute to James.
It's testament, Mark, to what you said about they seem to be geared towards America, because Back on the Chain Gang went to number 5 in America.
Oh, okay.
Whereas it only went to 11 here and 17 in the UK. So it was a very American-sounding Pretenders at that point.
When did the single come out?
That was September 82, Back on the Chain Gang.
So the album didn't come out, the third album didn't come out for a long time after that.
No, that's right. That's right. Well, apparently the song was partly inspired by a Sam Cooke song, Chain Gang, 1960
Yeah.
single, and I don't know if you've heard the song, but you can certainly hear the influence.
Back on the train. Back on the chain gang.
Yeah, I didn't realise that the 2,000 Miles didn't come out till November 83.
That's a great song.
Do you like that? Because I have a story about that. If we're jumping to November 83, as you know, Mark, I went to the UK in November 83, and I was a fresh-faced 21-year-old. I hired a car and I was driving around the north of England, and there was this moment where I got lost near a place called Huddersfield, if you know where that is.
The Sex Pistols played a Christmas gig
They played 2 shows on Christmas Day
in Huddersfield.
for the kids.
Yeah, for the kids.
Doing it for the kids.
Yeah.
Charity show.
That wasn't when I was there. And I got lost while I was driving around. And it was a classic horror movie setting. Like there was fog everywhere, and there was these old churches. There was someone digging in the church. It wasn't a grave digger, but someone was digging in the church, and I was running out of petrol. And there was a moment where I had to stop, and I saw this pub, and I went in there. I walked in, and I don't know whether there was that much noise within the pub, but it got quieter as I walked through, as I walked in.
Did it have those sort of saloon doors that you... And everybody turned around
Everyone
and
turned
stopped?
around, yeah. A glass smashed in the corner.
I think you saw this in a movie.
Yes.
I don't know that this ever happened.
It was very much, what was the movie at the time?
Blazing Saddles?
No.
Sure, you weren't watching a movie on TV in your hotel in Huddersfield that evening.
I was relaxing. No, but basically, when I walked into this pub, 2,000 Miles had just been released, and it was playing on the jukebox or the radio or something. So rather than that song being a joyous Christmas song that I would hear every year, it's a constant reminder of me being stranded in the middle of this sort of spooky English town. But yeah, I also love the song. I think it's great. But, it has become a bit of a Christmas standard now, which is pretty nice.
Children will sing. He'll be back at Christmas time.
Malcolm Foster and Robbie McIntosh were now in the band. Robbie had been a friend of James's, and James thought he was a great guitarist, so he was an ideal person to come in. Chrissy had a daughter by now with Ray Davies, Natalie. But they had been through the mill. In the words of Martin Chambers, the past 18 months or so have been like some bloody Agatha Christie thriller, one disaster after another.
Well, are we going to mention about Pete Farnham?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, well, he died in April 1983, so
83,
I suppose during the recording or pre the album coming out anyway.
It was a heroin overdose, and he was in a bathtub or something. So that would have been pretty tragic. I think his girlfriend or wife found him.
Well, he'd been out with his girlfriend and his wife found him. They were 2 different people.
Oh, really? No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that was a terrible tragedy as well. And in fact, the last time Chrissy saw Pete was at James's funeral in Hereford.
The year before.
They hadn't talked then. And she had been romantically involved with Pete at a certain point on the way through.
Didn't know that.
Really?
So are we now in January 1984?
January 84, Learning to Crawl.
Learning to Crawl. And the Pretenders, as Mark and I will attest, toured Australia in January 84.
Yes.
How was that then?
Part of that tour, they supported Talking Heads on the Talking Heads Stop Making Sense tour. That's a hell of a double bill. They played at the Melbourne Entertainment Centre, and in those days I was a budding music journalist, so I contacted Pretenders management, Dave Hill, and said, how about an interview, Gov?
As long as you didn't ask him how he was going, because he may have said, I'm going to bed.
That's right,
I'm going to bed.
Yeah, so I said, it'd be great to get an interview, Dave, and so he teed it up. Me and my friend Alistair turned up to the soundcheck, Pretenders soundcheck, and tried to find somewhere to kind of sit down and interview Chrissy. And we eventually found a gutter in the car park, and we sat down in the gutter side by side and we interviewed Chrissy. And
For what magazine?
For the Melbourne University newspaper. And I was 19 at the time and she was 33. And I felt like a kid, like I felt like a child, and she's like a real adult. It was quite intimidating. But she was so friendly and so nice and just very kind of matter of fact. At a certain point, I asked a question to Chrissy and Al interjected before she could answer and said, that's a stupid question.
Do you remember the question?
And in fairness, it probably was. It almost certainly was a stupid question. I wish I could.
He's meant to have your back at that point.
Yes, aren't we on the same team here?
You've not met him, have you?
Excuse my friend.
Yeah, that's right.
He knows not what he says. I thought you said when you said you were all in the gutter, I thought you were going to say.
Some of us are looking at the stars.
Well, I think that's where she got it from, albeit that she'd already written the song.
Oh.
Yeah, and she could not have been nicer. And then we walked back towards the venue and someone called out to her from beyond the kind of wire fence and said, Chrissy. And she went over and this guy said, Chrissy, I couldn't get a ticket for the show. Can you get me in on the door? And she said, sure. What's your name? And he said, Patrick. And she turned to me and said, oh, you Patrick. Like, how many Patricks are there in this country? And so anyway, so this guy called Patrick got in on the door.
And you didn't.
And I had to pay the full fare. I mean,
Patrick.
Where's the justice? Yeah, well,
You should have gone there early and said, I'm Patrick.
yeah, I should have. That would have been great. But yeah, it was a good show, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, it's great.
It was somewhat overshadowed by the curtain went down and then, half an hour later, there's a lone cassette recorder on the stage. David Byrne walks out.
Hi, I got a tape I want to play.
The legendary gig kind of
Yes.
commences. One thing that struck me from the interview that rankled a bit was that she kept talking about, like, her prime sort of thesis at the time was, look, it's just rock and roll. I just want to rock and roll. I just want to play rock and roll. All I want to do is rock and roll.
Yeah.
And that terminology was the opposite of the terminology.
He didn't want to hear that.
I had a particular dislike of that term because that was real kind of old school talk or conservative talk, I would have said. So
yeah, you could say maybe get away with rock, but if you said rock and roll, it's like...
Yeah, that was the language she had chosen to use, and she had always used that kind of language, and she was a rock kid. She was not a punk kid, really. She kind of transcended punk. She was probably too old for punk when it started anyway. She was, 23, 24-ish?
Yeah, a bit older.
When all that stuff was happening, and she was with these kind of snotty kids, Sex Pistols and so on, and it was just a different language. She was using the word in a different way to how I would have used it. Yeah, the actual album, Learning to Crawl, what did you guys make of it?
You bought it, Graham?
I didn't buy it.
I did buy it, and I can't remember whether it was after I interviewed Chrissy or because I knew I was going to. Or
as I said, I was disappointed by the second album, and I didn't buy this one. Listening to it now, middle of the road in Changang, once again, pretty standard rock stuff. Featured Billy Bremner from Rockpile and Tony Butler from Big Country. Watching the Clothes, I think, is a great lyric.
Watching the clothes go round, watching the clothes go round, watching the clothes go round.
And it's a really unusual chord progression. There's a song called Show Me, which I really like. My City Was Gone has a great beat and bass line. Thin Line Between Love and Hate features Paul Carrack from Squeeze. They had a big hit in America with a song called Tempted, and Paul Carrack sang the first verse of that.
I bought a toothbrush, some toothpaste, a flannel for my face.
And he plays piano and sings on that.
It's a thin line between love and hate.
And I Hurt You, I think, is a great song. So there's some good stuff on there, but I wasn't a fan at the time. And I could see, even at this point, they were not mellowing, but maybe they had their sights on America, perhaps.
Wasn't this their most commercially successful album to that point?
To this point,
overall, it was.
it got to number 5 in the US, but funny enough, only got to number 11 in the UK, whereas the first album went maybe even first week in at number 1. So, yeah, it definitely had more of an American feel. Mark, what did you make of it?
Just what Graham said, pretty much exactly the same thing. It just feels a bit lighter overall, but the band is actually tighter than the original band, to my ears anyway. Not that there was anything wrong with them, but it's really, really slick and very, very accomplished. I thought My City Was Gone was great because it had a bit of a funk element, which they'd never really done before.
Yeah, I think what occurred to me, and still does occur to me, about the album is that it is an album about growing up. It's an album about being an adult by a former wild child. Thumbelina, for instance, is a song about being on the road with her little baby girl and hush, little baby, my poor little thing, you've been shuffled about like a pawned wedding ring. It must seem strange love was here then gone, that kind of idea. And the lyrics of Middle of the Road, I think, are really funny. The middle of the road is no private cul-de-sac. I can't get from the cab to the curb without some little jerk on my back. Don't harass me, can't you tell? I'm going home, I'm tired as hell. I'm not the cat I used to be. I got a kid, I'm 33, baby. and there aren't many hit singles that have the line, I got a kid, I'm 33. It's a really kind of bold lyric. And she was she the first kind of really rebellious, leather-clad chick who was also a mother and who was also flying the flag for motherhood at the same time as flying the flag for rebellion and rock and roll.
And feminism.
It was a really interesting kind of mix. And it doesn't feel like a tired, middle-aged album to me. It does feel quite middle of the road. It's not an edgy album, even though it's got certain edgy lyrics. Never trust a user with your television overnight, for instance, which is good advice. And those sorts of things, that's kind of raw, gritty sort of stuff. And My City Was Gone, talking about Akron in particular, but maybe Cleveland as well, just being all the beautiful little shops and all the character of the place have been completely, wrecked and ruined by shopping malls and all that.
All my favorite places, my city had been pulled down.
And, that's something that she writes about quite a bit in her book, but it's something that a lot of us can relate to, about what happens in, big city urban environments. So I think the lyric matter is quite mature, but also still a little bit edgy. Having said all that, it is quite a mainstream kind of rock and roll kind of album. I think it's a really good rock album, but I listened to it a lot at the time and it was almost a guilty pleasure because I knew I shouldn't like it as much as I liked quite a lot of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she was definitely following her muse and she wasn't selling out. It felt like a very natural progression to me for her to have done this with this third album.
Speaking of natural progressions, didn't she meet Jim Kerr on this tour in Australia?
She did indeed, yeah. Simple Minds and Eurythmics and Talking Heads and Pretenders were all staying at the same hotel. So I guess she had split from Ray.
She went for a younger model and you a sleeker rock star.
You could have knocked us Simple Minds fans over with a feather when we heard the news. How did he do it?
I just wanted to touch on when the Pretenders were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think it was 2005, and Chrissy was there with Martin Chambers. I just thought I really liked this quote before we finish up, if we are. She said, "We're paying tribute to James Honeyman Scott and Pete Farndon, without whom we wouldn't be here."
And on the other hand, without us, they might have been here. But that's the way it works in rock and roll.
Well, that was really quite poignant and
Yeah.
very cleverly put.
She did say in her book that without James, you probably wouldn't be reading this book.
But conversely, without Chrissy Hind, there's no Pretenders. They're just a bunch of jobbing musicians.
Yeah,
she's the star of the whole story, isn't she?
Yeah.
She is a star. I mean, to write the songs on that first album from a standing start is pretty impressive.
So how are we going to end this one?
So, Mark, what do the Pretenders mean to you when all's said and done?
Yeah, look, I think they're a valid addition. I know some people wouldn't agree with that, but I think she's so punk rock, Chrissy Hind, that you can't really leave them out of the story. The music itself isn't particularly adventurous. The songs are great. She's written these songs from nowhere, and that was her destiny to be a rock star, and she's a hell of a great rock star. In the tradition of Debbie Harry, Joan Jett, Patti Smith.
I think I have a sentimental attachment to the Pretenders. Like the Jam, they were an important part of the punk movement, but I don't think they advanced post-punk in new and creative ways like the other bands we've spoken about. But they were always creating great songs about interesting subject matters, and Chrissy was blessed with that unmistakable voice that I still enjoy listening to today.
Well, I think she wrote about life and about being a woman in a way that no one else, it seems to me, was really doing. I mean, Debbie Harry's lyrics, there were love songs, but they never felt quite as real and quite as gritty. And, I mean, maybe there are parallels with someone like Marianne Faithfull, for instance, in terms of just the kind of raw, you're not going to get much more raw than Marianne Faithfull songs. But Chrissy was in that general territory at times. But the kind of contrast between the absolutely beautiful love songs she sang and wrote and the really tough kind of don't mess with me stuff, which a lot of that was just a front, she admits. From the age of about 15 or 16, when she was seeing those bands back in Akron, she just wanted to rock and roll. It was the highest calling you could possibly have, and she fulfilled that to the nth degree, always playing music. Sorry, I'm talking about it as if she's deceased, but in the 3 albums we're talking about, she's absolutely doing her own thing amid some pretty trying circumstances, tragic circumstances, and the Pretenders would go on to greater success as well, and she's still playing and she's still doing exactly what she wants to do, and I think she is one of the great post-punk success stories, and more than that, one of rock and roll's great success stories.